This section describes the economic model for the radio industry. In terms of its revenues, essentially all of radio's revenue comes from advertising, right, where companies buy spots on radio stations to promote their goods and services. Radio, among media, specializes in more local media advertising. Now, in terms of the overall budget for advertising for all media, radio has roughly an 8% share of advertising. Now, the revenue that it gets from advertising has dropped in recent years, but that hasn't stopped the steady growth in terms of the numbers of radio stations that operate in the U.S. Now, in terms of its expenses, only about roughly 20% of the budget for a radio station goes towards its programming costs. In large part, that's because it gets pre-recorded music from the major record labels essentially for free. Now, that may change in the future as the labels and copyright organizations try to get radio to pay more for access to this music. But for now, the recorded music it plays is almost free. And it doesn't have to pay a lot for the syndicated and national programming that is played on its stations. Essentially, the model for that works something like this. These national networks provide the local radio station with its programming in exchange for time slots for national ads. So a network may say to a local station, here, you can play this daily Ryan Seacrest show, and all we ask is that you allow us to use some of the time for advertising on that show for national ads, and we'll keep the revenue for that. The chapter on popular music addressed the issue of payola. Just as a reminder, payola is a practice where record companies or record promoters would pay DJs a certain amount of money to play particular records by artists that they want featured. I mean, obviously, it's in the interests of the record companies and promoters to get publicity for their artists, and this was one of the easiest and unethical ways to do that, is just pay the DJs money under the table to get them to play the music that they wanted to promote. Now, this, of course, was a big scandal in the 1950s. There were congressional investigations. People were fined, went to jail, and at least in theory, that took care of the problem. However, what we found is that the problem of payola was not so easily solved, and that it continues to be an issue up into the present day. One big example of payola was revealed in 2007 when 4 large broadcasters agreed to pay over $12 million to settle a payola investigation by the Federal Communications Commission. And more generally, the reoccurrence of payola scandals exemplifies the interconnected, interdependent relationship between the major record companies and record promoters and radio stations, right? Because they kind of need each other. Radio stations need to play popular music that people are going to want to listen to. And the major record companies, music labels, they need to get publicity for their artists. And so a lot of times that relationship leads the record companies and radio stations to do unethical things, as exemplified by the payola scandals. One of the most prominent trends in the radio industry over the past few decades has been the huge movement towards consolidation and concentration in ownership of radio stations. Now, to some extent, this resulted from a government law in 1996, the Telecommunication Act of 1996, passed by Congress and signed by then President Clinton, that eliminated most ownership restrictions in radio. And to understand the scope of this act, we need to know just a little bit of history in terms of ownership of media and regulation in the radio business. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. government had pretty firm limits on how many radio stations any one company could own. The thinking at that time was that we should, as a society, limit the number of radio or TV stations that any one company or party owns, because that will increase the number of independent owners of radio and TV stations, and hopefully increase diversity, freedom of expression, and the range of views presented in society. Now, that view of government has radically shifted over the past 20 or 30 years. Since that time, the U.S. government has increasingly done away with a lot of the ownership restrictions in both radio and television. So back in the 50s or 60s, a company could not own more than 7 AM radio stations, 7 FM radio stations, and 7 television stations. Well, since that time, those restrictions have been completely abolished, so that as a result of the 1996 Telecommunication Act, a company could essentially buy as many radio stations as they wanted. Well, as a result of that act, media companies went on a buying spree, buying up and acquiring lots of previously independent radio stations, and that trend in terms of buying up radio stations progressed to such a degree that now today 3 large companies, Clear Channel, Cumulus, and CBS, own about 1,500 radio stations in the U.S., which is more than 10% of all radio stations in the country. And actually, if you even look at one of these companies, Clear Channel, it sold off some of its stations recently because of the bad economy. But as of several years ago, Clear Channel itself had more than 1,000 radio stations. These 3 companies dominate the 50 largest markets in the U.S., and combined, they're responsible for about 1/2 of the entire radio industry's overall revenue from advertising. So some critics argue that one result of this consolidation is that these 3 companies have a huge influence over the radio business, and perhaps too much influence over programming and the range of ideas that are presented on radio stations owned by these 3 companies. For instance, some critics argue that Clear Channel in particular is known for its conservative politics, and some commentators have noticed that a lot of Clear Channel stations tend to really promote conservative views. For instance, many Clear Channel stations presented programming in favor of the Bush administration and the intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, questions about whether or not these three companies perhaps have too much power, too much influence over radio. There's also concerns about how this concentrated control of the radio business affects the content of radio stations more generally. Here, too, some critics have argued that as these three companies have bought up radio stations all across the country, that they've instituted policies that have led to more and more of a homogeneous sound, so that some critics argue that if you travel to different cities across the country that have Clear Channel stations, they'll all sound the same. They'll all be KISS or Hits 95. They'll tend to play the same artists, the same music in the same order, and often have the same sounding DJs or announcers. And often, as that story at the beginning of the chapter points out, sometimes they are indeed the same announcers that work for Clear Channel or CBS that are just recording announcements that air on lots of different radio stations. So I guess that's a concern for us, is what's happening to American radio stations today, and are they losing their distinctive local nature? And is that something that we should be concerned about? Or could we say that other forms of audio or radio, like satellite radio, have stepped into the breach and provided us with other alternatives? So this is actually something for us to talk about in the discussion boards, which is how has this consolidation in the radio business affected the content of and the programming presented by radio stations today, and is that a good or a bad thing?